So we now know that there's both neutrons and protons inside the nucleus. We've learned about the electromagnetic force, and this tells us that there's an electrostatic repulsion between like charges. So this begs the question, why don't the protons inside the nucleus repel each other? Well, you've also learned about the gravitational force, so maybe there's a gravitational attraction between the protons and the neutrons and the protons and the protons, and it turns out that there is, but this is very, very small and not enough to overcome that electrostatic repulsion. So it turns out that the solution to this conundrum is that there is in fact a third force. So this third force is known as the strong nuclear force, and on the size of a nucleus it is 130 times stronger than the electromagnetic force. So typical nuclear sizes are 10 to the minus 15 meters, which is known as the femtometer after Enrico Fermi. Now this strong nuclear force has some interesting properties. For one thing, it's independent of charge. So if we have two similar particles which are just different on charge, there won't be any difference in the strong nuclear force between those particles based on that charge. Another interesting property is that it doesn't have an infinite range. So unlike the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force, which obeyed an inverse square law, the strong nuclear force has a finite range, and beyond that range, it's zero. Interestingly, it also becomes negative or repulsive at really small scales. So if particles are separated by a distance of less than half a femtometer, the strong nuclear force actually turns out to be repulsive, which means that particles have a distance apart that they like to be. If they're closer than that, then there's a repulsive force between them. If they're further than that, then they no longer feel the attractive force. So this sets the distance at which the particles inside the nucleus like to be from each other. And as a result of this, it actually turns out that nuclei of many different types of elements all have the same density, as all the particles, the neutrons and the protons inside the nucleus, like to be at the same distance from each other. So because the strong force only has a small range, the strong force only allows particles very close to each other to interact. When you get beyond that, then it's no longer possible for those particles to interact, so they stop being attracted by the strong nuclear force. So this is actually why we have a limit to the size of nuclei. Uranium is the largest nucleus which we can find in nature. When we start going beyond that, then the nucleus gets so big that the strong nuclear force can no longer overcome the electromagnetic repulsion of the protons within the nucleus. So this then begs the question, well, how do nuclei decay then? So some nuclei are stable for a long time and then they decay. If we have the strong nuclear force, which is holding them all together, the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force, why would anything change? Why would the carbon-14 suddenly decide to decay? Well, it turns out that to explain why they decay, we actually need a fourth force known as the weak nuclear force. So the weak nuclear force is important because it allows a neutron to decay into an electron and a proton. So later we'll be looking at beta decay, and in order to have beta decay, we need to have this weak nuclear force. So the weak nuclear force, like the strong nuclear force, only has a limited range. It's much weaker than the strong nuclear force. So in fact, it's also weaker than the electromagnetic force. It's slightly stronger than the gravitational force. So the weak nuclear force is important for some other odd properties of nature as well. So it actually turns out to be the only force that can violate parity and charge parity. So you may have heard, if you've done some chemistry, about the chirality of molecules. So for example, DNA is all found going in a helix structure in one direction and not the other. And it turns out that there's actually a small energy difference between the left-hand chirality and the right-hand chirality of DNA. And we actually need the weak nuclear force to be able to calculate this energy difference. Without the weak nuclear force, these two would be identical, just reflections of each other. So to summarise, in nature there's four forces. We've got the electromagnetic force, the gravitational force, the strong nuclear force, which is needed to bind nucleons into the nucleus, and the weak nuclear force, which is needed to allow somewhat stable nuclei to decay.